Way back when we were 17, Sal had a girlfriend. She was very tiny, pretty, sweet. She had these big black doe eyes and was always smiling. She was also very possessive of Sal. I'm certain she disliked me from the moment we met, but realized that since I was the best friend who just happened to be a girl, we were a package deal, him and me, together. So she tolerated me. I understood, and always went out of my way to make her more comfortable. But there was just no soothing her. Even though we were only 17, she and her mother wanted him to buy her a diamond ring. They were pressuring him to get engaged to her. His mother would say, "Salvatore, you are too young. Don't even think about that, or I will kill you." He was desperate to break it off, but he really didn't know what to do. He started to use me as an excuse to avoid taking her out. If she said, "Let's go to the movies Friday night," he would say, "Oh, I can't. I've got something to do with Rosina." Ultimately, he told her that he and I were now going out together. And so she and he had reached the end. He only confessed this to me later, after I had ran into her on Passyunk Avenue, and she exploded on me. Sal taught me how to drive a manual shift car. I learned on his old pumpkin-colored Corvette, which his dad bought him when he turned 17. The day it arrived, a few of his dad's friends, they drove up in it and started beeping the horn. Sal and his dad came running out of the house, and suddenly there was this huge party in the middle of the street. We were all laughing, having such a good time over his reaction. He was hugging and kissing all of those guys. And then, of course, he and I got in, and off we went, all around South Philadelphia, all night. One time when we were in Atlantic City, Sal says to me, "Let's stop in and see Nicky." So I say, "Okay," and off we went. There on Georgia Avenue, the houses are old and large, and very close together. His wife Mimi let us in and accompanied us into the dining room. She had fuzzy blonde hair, blue eyes, and a tiny face. She was timid and shy, but very sweet. The entryway of the house was quite dark, and the air heavy. The dining room walls were covered in ordinary plywood paneling. In each of the room's four corners stood a coat of armor. When I whispered to Sal, "This is too fucking weird. I want to leave right now," he points his index finger at me and tells me to try and behave myself. I had never seen such a badly decorated room before, nor had I ever felt the dark, heavy energy I felt in that house. It felt like a crowded South Broad Street funeral home on the night of a viewing. Mr. Scarfo greeted me warmly, with a kiss on each cheek, then sat down and directed his attention to Sal. They spoke softly. After a few minutes, he rang a little dinner bell and Mimi came running in. He asked her to make some coffee, then looked over at me and said, "Why don't you go into the kitchen with Mimi and help her?" Sal shot me a quick look as if to say, "Don't even fucking question it." So, into the kitchen I went with Mimi. She was from the small town in Calabria where Mr. Scarfo's parents were born. After his first wife, Teresa, left him, he went there to find another wife and met Domenica, Mimi. When we were safely in the car, I told Sal that being in that old relic of a house, that mausoleum, had been the single strangest experience I had ever had in my life. I told him of my impressions about the thickness of the air and Mimi's resignation, and of course, he got upset with me. Sal considers Mr. Scarfo a second father. He loves him. Our bail for killing Vince Falcone restricted us from traveling outside of Atlantic County. That meant we weren't able to meet with guys like Caponigro or Bobby Manna to know what was going on in North Jersey or New York. Now remember, a few months before we killed Vince Falcone, we had that dinner with Bobby Manna in North Jersey. And that got my uncle's antenna up that something was going on. That maybe there was going to be a move against Ange. With our bail, we couldn't go to Philadelphia either. Chucky and Salvie were coming down from Philly a few times a week to see us, to let us know what was going on. But they didn't know anything about Caponigro or Bobby Manna. All they knew was the stuff in South Philly. So, at the time, we were basically stuck in Atlantic City and out of the loop on what was really going on. My uncle said, "We're gonna let things play out, see what happens with Lefty," meaning Ange, "and we're gonna lay low for a while and get ready for this trial. If we don't win this fucking trial, nothing else matters, because we're dead." At the time, I was busy with Scarf Inc., and Lawrence was busy with Nat Nat, his rod company. My uncle was meeting a lot with Harold, going over the discovery in the Falcone case with the attorneys. Meanwhile, up in North Jersey, Antonio Tony Bananas Caponigro, the consigliere of the Bruno crime family, was doing everything but lying low. He was planning to assassinate his boss, longtime Philadelphia mob don, Angelo Bruno, and take over the family. As 1979 turned to 1980, Chicago-born Caponigro was the head of a growing intra-family movement that opposed the old-school Bruno's strict opposition to allowing mobsters to engage in the extremely lucrative distribution of narcotics, and his continued resistance to exploit the family's Atlantic City operation beyond the traditional street rackets, which at the time consisted primarily of gambling, loan sharking, and extortion under the careful watch of NICODEMO Scarfo, who ran Atlantic City, much like Caponigro ran North Jersey. In the months prior to his death, Angelo Bruno had all but lost control of the crime family he had led for the previous 2 decades. Bruno and his longtime underboss, Philip Chicken Man Testa, were feuding over money and power and not speaking with one another. Bruno was involved in a dispute over control of the Atlantic City casino unions with Nicky Scarfo, whom he had unsuccessfully tried to turn against Testa several months earlier. The ambitious and treacherous Caponigro had started flirting with the idea of killing Bruno sometime around the summer of 1979, after a series of clandestine mob sit-downs with Frank Funzy Thierry, the powerful Genovese gangster who Caponigro thought had given him the green light to kill Bruno by telling him, "Our friends on the commission said, do what you gotta do." For more than 2 decades, beginning in 1959, Bruno ran the Philly mob like a business, not like a gangster. He was considered a racketeer and was dubbed the Docile Don by the local media. While the manner in which he ruled the underworld may have been docile, the manner in which he was about to die was not. The bespectacled, soft-spoken Bruno was known as Ange to those who knew him well, and Mr. Bruno to those who didn't. Around 10:30 p.m. on March 21st, 1980, Bruno was sitting in the front passenger seat of a Chevy Caprice, being driven by a young Sicilian-born mob associate named John Stanfa. Bruno's normal driver, his trusted aide, Raymond Long John Martirano, had conspicuously made himself unavailable a short time earlier when it was time to drive the Don home from her dinner meeting with subordinates at a popular South Philadelphia restaurant named Cuz Little Italy, which was owned by one of Bruno's capos, a Siggy named Frank Sindone, and had previously been the site of Piccolo's 500 Club, which had been owned by Nicky Scarfo's uncles, the Piccolo brothers. Over the last few months, Sindone, who was known as the Barracuda, had become close with Antonio, Tony Bananas Caponigro. Sindone, who ran a very large gambling and loan sharking operation in South Philadelphia, seemed to share Caponigro's belief that Bruno was no longer the best fit to run the family. Bruno was not aware of any of this, as he accepted a kiss on the cheek from Sindone as he was leaving Cuz Little Italy that night. Some underworld observers believe that Sindone had purposely marked Bruno with the kiss of death. As the Stanford-driven Caprice approached Bruno's home, which sat at the corner of 9th and Snyder, in the heart of South Philadelphia. Bruno had no idea he was living the final seconds of his life. Waiting in the shadows with a sawed-off shotgun under his trench coat was Bruno's executioner, Antonio Tony Bananas Caponigro, the power-hungry and treacherous North Jersey mob leader who was Bruno's consigliere and had set in motion the palace coup to remove Bruno from power. It was all about greed and treason, which was the Sicilian calling card, according to Nicky Scarfo. As Stanford pulled the car to the curb, he lowered the front passenger window so that Bruno could flick his cigarette into the gutter. As he did so, Caponigro emerged from the shadows, removed the sawed-off shotgun from under his trench, aimed it square at the back of Bruno's head, and fired from close range. On the night that Ange got killed, I was at Caesar's with the Blade. We had just finished eating dinner, and we were downstairs in the lobby getting ready to leave. As we're leaving, we bump into Salvie, who was Ange's longtime attorney. So, Sal is making small talk with me about the Falcone case, when all of a sudden, some guy he was with comes running up to him, screaming, "Oh my God! They killed Ange! It's on TV! They shot him outside his home! He's dead!" Now, Salavina is going nuts. "Oh my God! Oh my God!" Me and the Blade, we try to calm him down, but he was very upset. He and Ange, they were really close. So, me and the Blade, we leave Caesar's, and we're walking back to Georgia Avenue, which is just a few blocks away. I go right up to my uncle's apartment. I ask him, had he heard the big news? He was sitting on the couch, reading the newspaper, with his reading glasses on. He put the paper down, took off his glasses, and motioned for me to follow him outside. When we got outside, he says to me, "What's the big news? What's going on?" So I tell him, "Ange is dead. He got shot outside his home tonight." My uncle made a face, like he was both happy and surprised. We went into the Scarfo office and watched what was going on TV. It was live on TV. All the Philly stations were carrying it. A little while later, Lawrence comes to the office. He says he spoke to Chucky, who is in South Philadelphia, that everybody down there is going nuts, trying to figure out what the fuck happened. Chucky also sent word that Testa was sending Salvie down first thing in the morning with a message for my uncle. Now, at the time, we couldn't leave Atlantic County because of our bail. And Testa, he couldn't come to New Jersey because the same SCI that had sent my uncle to Yardville wanted to give him a subpoena to testify. If he had gotten served, he wouldn't have testified, and he would have wound up sitting in jail like my uncle and Ange when they went to Yardville. So everything was being done through messengers. First thing in the morning, like clockwork, here comes Salvie. It's like 7:30 in the morning, and he's by himself. Me, him, and my uncle, we take a walk up Georgia Avenue towards Atlantic. There was a little coffee shop there that we used to go to, called the Cup and Saucer. While we're walking, Salvie says to my uncle, "My dad needs you to go to New York, find out what's going on. Nobody knows nothing. No one knows who did it, and no one knows who's in charge. It's fucking chaos out there." My uncle says, "I'll see what I can do, but we can't leave Atlantic City because of our bail restrictions. And these cocksuckers, they watch us all fucking day. They don't let up." As we're eating our breakfast, my uncle pulls me aside, tells me to call Harold Garber, have him meet us on Georgia Avenue. So I excuse myself. I call Harold, give him the message. He says he'll be there in 20 minutes. As we're walking back, my uncle says to Salvie, "Tell your father he's in charge. He's the underboss. That's the way it works in this thing, in La Cosa Nostra. And don't let nobody tell him any different." My uncle says, "You make sure you guys are careful. Watch out for this." And he shakes his finger like a gun, because this plot may not be over. He says, "Give me a few days. I'll find out what's going on from my friends in New York." Salvie says goodbye, and he drives off as Harold is pulling up. My uncle says to Harold, "I need to go to North Jersey tomorrow. I need you to make it happen." Harold says, "Nick, you can't go to North Jersey. You can't leave Atlantic County. You know that." My uncle cuts him off and says, "Find a way, Harold. Work your fucking magic. But I need to be in North Jersey tomorrow." So later that day, Harold calls. He tells my uncle he's all set. He can go to Newark and meet with the lawyer the next day at 1 p.m. Harold had a lawyer friend in Newark, and this guy gave Harold the okay to let my uncle use his office for the meeting. Now, my uncle wants to get word to Bobby Manna that he wants to meet him. But my uncle doesn't use telephones, and neither does Bobby Manna. Normally, we'd get word to Bobby using Blackie Napoli, but my uncle didn't want any of the North Jersey guys to know that he was coming up there. And even though my uncle and Blackie were tight, Blackie was Caponigro's right-hand man. So my uncle has Lawrence call Chucky and tell him that my uncle needs to see him right away in Atlantic City. An hour later, here comes Chucky. My uncle tells him, "I need you to go to New York and get word to Bobby Manna that I need a sit-down with him tomorrow." He gives Chucky the address to the lawyer's office in Newark, and on the paper it says 1 p.m. Now, Chucky doesn't know these guys in New York, not like we do, but Bobby Manna knew Chucky and that he was with my uncle. So Chucky leaves Atlantic City and goes to New York, to Greenwich Village, where my uncle told him to go. I think it was a bakery. Chucky leaves the message with the guy at the bakery, turns around, and drives back to Atlantic City. He never sees Bobby. But this is how it was done. So, me, my uncle, Chucky, and Lawrence, we go for an early dinner at Angelini's. This is the day after Ange is killed. All this happens within a matter of hours. The meeting with Salvie, Chucky going to New York. We start hearing bits and pieces about what happened. We knew that John Stanford was the driver, and my uncle tells us at dinner, I think the guy in North Jersey, meaning Caponigro, and the Barracuda, meaning Sindone, have something to do with this. And if I'm right, they may have a few more names on their list, meaning Phil Testa, Chicky Narducci, and maybe even my uncle. My uncle says, tomorrow when I meet with Bobby, I'll find out exactly what's going on. Chucky says, Nick, you want me to ride up with you? I mean, Christ, you could be walking into an ambush. My uncle says, nothing's gonna happen to me. Bobby is with us. I'll be fine. The next day, my uncle is up early. He's showered and shaved. He's wearing a suit. He heads up to Newark by himself. We had a black Cadillac at the time, and that's the car he drove. The night before, I parked it a few blocks away so that he could sneak away on foot and get into the car without being picked up by any surveillance. Now, I'm in the Scarfo office all day, and it seems like everyone and their mother are stopping in. Lawrence was there. The Blade was there. Chucky and his son came down. Harold came by. Saul Kane was hanging around. Everybody was anxious, worried about my uncle going up there alone. Anxious at what Bobby Manna was going to tell him. So, around 4 p.m., the office phone rings. My cousin Chris answers it and hands it to me and says, it's my dad. I get on, and my uncle is talking in code. He says to me, I'm gonna lie down and get some rest. Call and wake me in about 2 hours. Which meant he would be back in Atlantic City in 2 hours. Then he says to me, I'm starting to feel a lot better ever since I saw the doctor, which meant everything went well with Bobby Manna. Then he says, if I'm feeling better, I want to have dinner with my friends tonight. Set it up. I knew by that he meant he wanted to have dinner with Phil Testa. Everything was always in code with my uncle. He constantly talked in circles. Sometimes Chucky or the Blade would say to him, you're losing me, Nick, which always made me laugh. But I was able to follow everything he was saying. I knew what he was going to say before he said it. That's how well I knew him. So I hang up and I clear out the office. I tell Chucky that we need to get word to Salvie in Philadelphia and tell him that my uncle wants to see him and his father for dinner in Atlantic City. Chucky says, no problem. So, around 6:30, 7, my uncle pulls up. Maybe 20 minutes after that, Salvie joins us. He had already dropped his father off at the restaurant to avoid us all being seen together. We go to Scanicchio's, and the owner, Vince, he sits us in the back, makes sure that we're seated in private, secluded. It was me, my uncle, Chucky, and Lawrence, Salvie, and Phil Testa. My uncle starts off by saying, it was North Jersey. Tony Bananas enters crew. Tony's making a play to take over the family, and the Barracuda is with him. Phil Testa shakes his head, says something in Italian, and slams his fist into the table, then says, "Okay, Nick." So what happens next?